The explosion rattled Lieutenant Sarah Chen's teeth as she pressed herself against the concrete barrier, dust and debris cascading around her like deadly snow. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear Captain Morrison's voice crackling through the radio, sharp and dismissive as always. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Rookie, what's your position? And don't give me another one of your textbook answers. Sarah's jaw clenched as she checked her tactical display. 3 months into her deployment with the 47th Special Operations Unit, and Morrison still called her that. Not Lieutenant Chen, not even Chen. Just Rookie, like she was some fresh-faced academy graduate instead of a decorated officer who'd graduated top of her class from both West Point and Ranger School. Alpha 7 is secure, sir. Enemy contact approximately 200 meters northeast of the compound. She kept her voice level, professional, even as another mortar round exploded close enough to shower her position with concrete chips. Copy that, Rookie. Stay put and let the real soldiers handle this. The radio went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the acrid smell of cordite and her own simmering frustration. Around her, the abandoned factory complex stretched like a concrete maze, its broken windows catching the last rays of the Iraqi sunset. This was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Get in, gather intelligence on the weapons cache, get out. Instead, they'd walked into what felt like half the insurgency in Fallujah. She shifted her position, careful to keep low, and caught sight of Sergeant Maria Rodriguez crouched behind an overturned truck about 30 meters away. Rodriguez had been the first person to treat Sarah like something other than an unwelcome addition to the unit. Where the other soldiers saw her youth, her gender, her by-the-book approach as weaknesses, Rodriguez saw potential. "You remind me of myself when I was starting out," Rodriguez had told her during their first week together, cleaning weapons in the armory. "Except I had to claw my way up from enlisted. You've got the education and the training. You just need to trust your instincts." Now Rodriguez was pinned down, blood seeping through a tear in her uniform sleeve, her usually steady hands shaking slightly as she tried to reload her rifle. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Assess, prioritize, act. Rodriguez was wounded, possibly seriously. The rest of the squad was scattered across the compound, and Morrison's last known position put him at least 5 minutes away, Sarah's. Fingers found the small compass her grandfather had given her before she shipped out. It was an old brass thing, worn smooth by decades of use, inscribed with Chinese characters she'd never learned to read. Her grandfather had carried it through Korea, her father through Vietnam. "It doesn't just show direction," her grandfather had whispered to her in Mandarin, the language he only spoke when sharing family secrets. "It shows the way forward when everything else is uncertain." The factory complex had a history that predated the current conflict by decades. Built in the 1960s as part of Saddam Hussein's industrial expansion, it had churned out everything from textiles to small electronics before the wars came. Local intelligence suggested it had been used as a meeting point for insurgent cells for at least 6 months. The building's layout was a tactical nightmare, multiple levels, countless hiding spots, and enough structural damage to make movement unpredictable. Sarah studied the compound through her scope, noting the patterns of movement in the shadows. There were at least 12 hostiles, maybe more, positioned strategically throughout the complex. They moved with practiced efficiency, suggesting this wasn't a random encounter, but a carefully planned ambush. The question was, had they been waiting specifically for Sarah's unit, or were they just protecting their cache? Through her earpiece, she could hear the chatter of her squad mates. Corporal Williams was reporting movement on the south side. Private Jackson was requesting ammunition. Specialist Thompson was trying to establish communication with base camp. All of them looking to Morrison for orders that weren't coming fast enough. Sarah watched Rodriguez attempt to move to better cover, only to be driven back by a burst of automatic fire. The sergeant's face was pale, her breathing shallow. Without immediate medical attention, she might not make it out of here. Sarah had field medic training, all officers did, but getting to Rodriguez meant crossing 40 meters of open ground under hostile fire. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again. All units maintain defensive positions. Air support is 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. Sarah did the math in her head. Rodriguez might have 15 minutes if she was lucky. The insurgents would probably be gone in half that time once they realized military reinforcements were incoming. This was the kind of situation her instructors at West Point had drilled into her. When following orders conflicts with saving lives, an officer must choose the harder path. But Morrison had made his position clear from day one. Sarah remembered her first briefing, standing at attention while he looked her up and down like she was a piece of equipment he'd been forced to accept. "I don't care what they taught you at the academy, rookie. Out here, experience matters more than textbooks. You watch, you learn, and you do exactly what I tell you to do. Nothing more, nothing less." The other soldiers had watched that exchange with expressions ranging from sympathy to amusement. Thompson, the unit's communications specialist, had shaken his head slightly. Williams, a career enlisted man with 2 tours under his belt, had actually smirked. Only Rodriguez had looked genuinely uncomfortable, and only Jackson, barely older than Sarah herself, had met her eyes with something like understanding. Now, crouched behind her concrete barrier with the taste of dust and fear in her mouth, Sarah realized that this moment would define not just her mission, but her entire career. She could follow Morrison's orders, stay put, and watch Rodriguez bleed out while they waited for air support. Or she could trust the training, the instincts, and the voice inside her head that sounded remarkably like her grandfather. The compass doesn't choose the easy path. It chooses the right one. Sarah keyed her radio, switching to the frequency she'd memorized for emergencies. "This is Alpha 7. I have eyes on Alpha 3. She's wounded and needs immediate extraction." Morrison's voice came back immediately, sharp with authority. "Alpha 7, you are to maintain position. That is a direct order." Sarah looked at Rodriguez again, saw the way the sergeant's hand had gone to her neck, checking her pulse. A combat medic's gesture, checking her own vitals because she knew what blood loss felt like. Rodriguez had saved 3 lives in Afghanistan, earned a Bronze Star for pulling wounded soldiers out of a burning vehicle. She'd taught Sarah how to read the subtle signs of IED placement, how to move through urban terrain without telegraphing her position, how to command respect without demanding it. The factory's broken windows reflected the dying sunlight like 100 watching eyes. Somewhere in those shadows, insurgents were waiting, patient as hunters. Sarah's tactical computer showed their positions as red dots, moving slowly but purposefully through the building's maze-like interior. She counted them again. 14 confirmed, possibly more in the basement levels. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her younger sister back in California. "Saw the news about your deployment. Dad's proud even if he won't say it. Stay safe, big sis." The message was 3 days old, delayed by military communications protocols, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her sister Emma was starting her senior year of high school, captain of the debate team, planning to follow Sarah to West Point. Their father, a retired Marine colonel, had trained both his daughters to think strategically, to see beyond the immediate tactical situation to the larger implications of every decision. What would her father do in this situation? What would Emma expect her big sister to do? Sarah already knew the answer. The Chun family didn't abandon their people, didn't leave soldiers behind, didn't prioritize following orders over saving lives. But as she prepared to move, Sarah caught sight of something that made her freeze. A small device partially hidden under debris near Rodriguez's position. It was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a soda can, with thin wires extending from both ends. Sarah had seen enough IEDs during her deployment to recognize the basic construction, but this one was different. The wires were too neat, too precisely placed. This wasn't a hastily assembled roadside bomb. It was a carefully positioned trap. The insurgents hadn't just been waiting in the factory. They'd been preparing the entire area, turning Rodriguez's cover into a potential kill zone. If Sarah tried a direct rescue, she might trigger the device and kill them both. But if she did nothing, Rodriguez would bleed out long before air support arrived. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, calculating angles and distances, weighing risks against probabilities. This was the kind of three-dimensional tactical problem her instructors had loved to pose during war games. But in the classroom, there had always been time to think, to discuss options with teammates, to run computer simulations. Here, with Rodriguez growing weaker by the minute and Morrison's voice demanding updates she couldn't give, Sarah realized that all her training had been preparing her for this exact moment, the moment when following orders might mean watching a good soldier die. Sarah's day had started, like every day for the past 3 months, at 0500 hours with the sound of Morrison's voice cutting through the pre-dawn. Darkness like a rusty blade. Rise and shine, rookie. Today we're going to see if you can keep up with real soldiers. She'd learned to dress in the dark, moving with the quiet efficiency her father had taught her during childhood camping trips. While her bunkmates stumbled around looking for gear, Sarah would already be laced, loaded, and ready, standing at attention beside her cot with the kind of military bearing that came from growing up in a family where good enough was never good enough. The irony wasn't lost on her that Morrison's casual dismissal actually motivated her to work harder. Every time he called her rookie, she pushed herself through an extra set of pull-ups. Every time he assigned her the most mundane tasks, inventory duty, equipment maintenance, paperwork, she completed them with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Her gear was always spotless, her reports always thorough, her performance always technically perfect. But technique wasn't enough for Morrison, and Sarah was beginning to understand why. She remembered the morning, 2 weeks into her deployment, when Rodriguez had found her in the armory at 0430, cleaning the same rifle for the 3rd time in 12 hours. You know that weapon's not going to get any cleaner, right? Rodriguez had settled beside her on the workbench, her own rifle already field-stripped for maintenance. Just want to make sure it's ready, Sarah had replied, not looking up from the bolt assembly she'd been polishing. Ready for what? We're running convoy escort today, not storming the beaches of Normandy. Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of gentle amusement that came from watching younger soldiers repeat her own mistakes. You trying to prove something? To Morrison? Sarah had finally looked up, meeting Rodriguez's eyes in the armory's fluorescent lighting. I'm trying to prove something to myself. That conversation had led to others. Late-night talks during guard duty when the desert stretched around them like a vast star-filled ocean. Rodriguez had shared stories of her own early days in the military, the struggles of earning respect as a woman in combat units, the difference between leadership through intimidation and leadership through competence. Morrison's old school, Rodriguez had explained one night, both of them watching the perimeter through night vision scopes. He came up through the enlisted ranks during the worst years of the Iraq War, lost a lot of good people, including some young officers who thought their education was enough to keep their soldiers alive. He's not trying to break you down for fun. He's trying to see if you'll break down when lives are on the line. Sarah had considered this, adjusting her scope to track a distant movement that turned out to be a stray dog. And what do you think? Will I break down? Rodriguez had been quiet for a long moment. I think you're asking the wrong question. It's not about whether you'll break down. Everyone breaks down eventually. It's about what you do after you break, how you put yourself back together, and whether you learn something from the breaking. Now, pinned down in the factory complex with Rodriguez bleeding out 30 meters away, Sarah felt the weight of that conversation like a physical presence. This was her breaking point, the moment Rodriguez had predicted would come. The question was what she would build from the pieces. Sarah's mind drifted to her daily routine, the small rituals that had kept her grounded during these difficult months. Every morning after Morrison's wake-up call, she would spend 5 minutes writing in a journal her grandfather had given her. Not about military operations, which were classified, but about her observations of the people around her, the landscape, the way light changed throughout the day. Her grandfather had kept similar journals during his service, filling dozens of small notebooks with sketches and thoughts that helped him process the psychological weight of combat. "Writing helps you see patterns," he'd told her during one of their long talks before her deployment. "Not just tactical patterns, but human ones. Leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about understanding how people respond to pressure, how they support each other, how they find courage when courage seems impossible." Sarah had filled nearly half of her current journal with observations about her unit. Thompson, the communications specialist, hummed old country songs under his breath when he was nervous. Williams, the career enlisted man, had a habit of checking and rechecking his weapon when he disagreed with orders but couldn't voice his objections. Jackson, the youngest member of their squad, asked questions constantly, not because he didn't understand, but because he learned better through dialogue than through silent observation. And Rodriguez had a tell that Sarah had noticed during their second week together. When the sergeant was planning something tactically complex, she would unconsciously trace patterns on her thigh with her index finger, as if drawing invisible maps. Sarah had seen her do it before difficult operations, during equipment inspections. And now, as she watched Rodriguez's position through her scope, she could see the sergeant doing it again despite her wound. Rodriguez wasn't just trying to stay alive. She was planning something. Sarah's earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice, impatient and sharp. "Alpha 7, I need a sitrep. What's your tactical assessment?" Sarah keyed her radio, choosing her words carefully. "Multiple hostiles confirmed in the main structure. Alpha 3 is wounded, but stable. I'm observing IED placement around potential extraction routes. Copy that. Air support is now 12 minutes out. Maintain defensive posture until they arrive." 12 minutes. Sarah did the math again, factoring in Rodriguez's blood loss, the insurgents' likely response to incoming air support, and the tactical reality of their position. By the time helicopters arrived, Rodriguez would either be dead, or the insurgents would have melted away into the urban maze of Fallujah, taking their intelligence with them. Sarah thought about her sister Emma's last letter, the one that had arrived just 3 days before this mission. Emma was struggling with calculus, worried about college applications, dating a boy their father pretended not to like. Normal teenage. Problems that seemed to exist in a different universe from Sarah's current reality. But Emma had also written something that stuck with Sarah. "Mrs. Patterson says that the hardest math problems can't be solved by just following the formula. Sometimes you have to see the pattern that isn't obvious, the connection that everyone else misses." Mrs. Patterson was Emma's calculus teacher, but she might as well have been describing military tactics. Sarah had been trying to solve this situation using the standard formulas: maintain position, wait for support, follow orders, minimize risk. But what if there was a pattern she was missing, a connection that wasn't obvious? Sarah studied the factory complex again, this time not as a tactical obstacle, but as a puzzle. The building had been constructed in the 1960s, designed for manufacturing efficiency. That meant predictable traffic patterns, standardized spacing between support columns, consistent sight lines through the main floor. The insurgents had positioned themselves to cover the obvious approach routes, but they were thinking like fighters, not like engineers. Sarah's grandfather had been an engineer before the Korean War, and some of his professional habits had influenced his military service. "Buildings have personalities," he'd told her once, walking through the construction site of what would become her childhood home. "They want to be used in certain ways, and if you understand that, You can predict how people will move through them. Sarah began to see the factory differently. The insurgents had set up their positions to defend against a conventional assault. Soldiers moving through doorways, up stairwells, through the main corridors. But what if someone approached the problem like an engineer instead of like a soldier? The factory's original design included a maintenance level, accessible through external service ladders that would be nearly invisible from the insurgents' positions. Sarah could see one of those ladders now, partially concealed by vegetation and structural damage, leading to a catwalk that ran along the building's north wall. From there, she might be able to reach an elevated position that would give her clear sight lines to both Rodriguez's position and the IED that threatened any rescue attempt. But reaching the ladder meant crossing 20 meters of open ground, climbing 30 feet of exposed metal structure, and then moving through a section of building that might or might not still be structurally sound. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, low-percentage maneuver that Morrison would forbid if he knew what she was considering. Sarah checked her gear automatically, rifle secure, sidearm loaded, medical kit accessible, communications equipment functioning. Her grandfather's compass seemed to grow heavier in her pocket, as if the old brass was absorbing her uncertainty. She thought about the inscription she couldn't read, the Chinese characters that had guided 3 generations of her family through moments of impossible decision. Through her scope, Sarah saw Rodriguez attempt to shift position again, only to be driven back by another burst of automatic fire. But in that brief moment of movement, Sarah caught something else. Rodriguez wasn't just trying to find better cover. She was trying to communicate, using hand signals that Sarah recognized from their training together. Rodriguez was spelling out tactical information, letter by letter, using the military alphabet signs they'd practiced during boring guard duty shifts. I-E-D ... exit. Her message was clear. She'd identified the explosive device Sarah had spotted, and she'd found what might be an alternative extraction route. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like tumblers falling into place in a complex lock. This wasn't just about following orders or disobeying them. This was about partnership, about the kind of tactical collaboration her instructors had described, but she'd never experienced in the field. Rodriguez wasn't just waiting to be rescued. She was providing intelligence that could make the rescue possible. Sarah keyed her radio, but instead of calling Morrison, she switched to the emergency frequency she'd memorized for dire situations. Alpha 3, this is Alpha 7, I copy your signal. Preparing to move to elevated position for overwatch. Rodriguez's response came immediately, her voice tight with pain but steady with purpose. Copy, Alpha 7. Be advised, movement pattern. Suggests enemy withdrawal preparation. Recommend expedited timeline. Morrison's voice cut across their communication like a whip crack. Alpha 7, you are to maintain current position. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. Sarah looked at her grandfather's compass one more time, feeling its weight like a physical reminder of all the difficult decisions that had brought her to this moment. Then she secured it in her chest pocket and began to move. Sarah's movement toward the service ladder felt like stepping across a threshold she could never uncross. Every step through the broken concrete and twisted metal of the factory's exterior was a choice to trust her own judgment over Morrison's explicit orders, to bet Rodriguez's life on tactical instincts that had never been tested under fire. Ladder was in worse condition than it had appeared through her scope. Several rungs were missing, others bent or partially detached from the mounting brackets. But it was still climbable, and more importantly, it was positioned in a blind spot that the insurgents hadn't thought to cover. Sarah began her ascent, moving with the careful precision her rock climbing experience had taught her, testing each handhold before committing her weight. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece, sharp with authority and growing anger. Alpha 7, respond immediately. What is your position? Sarah kept climbing, but she keyed her radio with her free hand. Alpha 7 is repositioning for tactical advantage, sir. Negative, Alpha 7. You are ordered to return to your previous position immediately. Sarah reached the catwalk level, 30 feet above the factory floor, and paused to assess her new vantage point. From here, she could see the entire tactical situation laid out like a three-dimensional chessboard. 14 insurgents, positioned exactly where she'd expected based on the building's traffic patterns. Rodriguez wounded, but alert, pressed against cover that was simultaneously protecting her and trapping her. And there, barely visible among the debris around the sergeant's position, the IED that would kill them both if Sarah attempted a direct rescue. But she could also see something else. The pattern Rodriguez had been trying to communicate. The insurgents weren't just defending their position. They were preparing to extract their weapons cache and disappear into Fallujah's urban maze. Sarah could see them moving equipment toward what appeared to be a previously prepared exit route through the building's basement level. If she waited for air support, she and Rodriguez might survive. But the intelligence value of this mission would be 0. Sarah keyed her radio again, this time addressing Rodriguez directly. Alpha 3, I have overwatch position. Can you identify the device's trigger mechanism? Rodriguez's response came after a pause that felt like an eternity. Appears to be pressure activated. Tripwire secondary. Estimate 15-foot kill radius. Morrison's voice cut across their communication like a sledgehammer. Alpha 7, you are in direct violation of orders. Return to ground level immediately or face court-martial. Sarah felt the weight of that threat like a physical blow. Court-martial meant the end of her military career, disgrace for her family, the destruction of everything she'd worked toward since she was Emma's age. But looking down at Rodriguez, seeing the way the sergeant's movements were growing weaker, Sarah realized that some things mattered more than career consequences. She switched to the unit's general frequency, addressing the entire squad. All Alpha units, this is Alpha 7. I have elevated overwatch position and clear sight lines to hostile positions. Recommend coordinated movement on my signal. Thompson's voice came through the radio, uncertainty clear in his tone. Alpha 7, Captain Morrison has ordered us to maintain defensive positions. Copy that, Alpha 4. I understand the captain's orders. Sarah adjusted her scope, ranging the distances to each insurgent position. I'm providing tactical intelligence. Only. Alpha 3 requires immediate medical attention, and I have visual confirmation of enemy withdrawal preparation. Williams joined the conversation, his career enlisted man's caution evident in every word. Alpha 7, what exactly are you seeing from up there? Sarah took a breath, choosing her words carefully. This was the moment when she would either earn her squad's trust or lose their respect forever. I'm seeing an opportunity to complete our mission objective while extracting our wounded. But it requires coordinated action, and it requires trust. Jackson's young voice crackled through the radio. What do you need us to do? Morrison's response was immediate and furious. Alpha 2, you are not to take orders from a subordinate officer who is currently in violation of direct commands. All units will maintain current positions until air support arrives. Sarah felt the tactical situation slipping away from her, the window of opportunity closing as the insurgents continued their withdrawal preparations. She thought about her grandfather's war stories, the moments when junior officers had to make decisions that senior commanders couldn't see from their positions. Leadership, he'd told her, sometimes meant being willing to be wrong in service of being right. All Alpha units, Sarah said, her voice carrying the command authority she'd never been allowed to use in the field. I'm going to paint targets for suppressive fire. You don't have to follow my lead, but if you trust me, we can save Alpha 3 and complete our mission. Sarah began identifying targets, calling out positions with the precise military terminology that turned her observations into actionable intelligence. Hostel 1, second floor northwest corner, approximately 200 meters. Hostel 2, ground floor main entrance, 150 meters. Hostel 3. As she worked, Sarah found herself falling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. This was what her training had prepared her for, not just following orders, but making the kinds of tactical decisions that could save lives and accomplish objectives. For the first time since arriving in Iraq, she felt like she was using her education and instincts instead of just enduring. Morrison's skepticism. Thompson was the first to respond. Alpha 4 has visual on Hostel 1, ready to provide suppressive fire on your signal. Williams followed, his voice carrying grudging respect. Alpha 2 has multiple targets acquired. What's your plan, Lieutenant? Sarah felt a surge of something that might have been hope or might have been terror. They were calling her Lieutenant, not Rookie. They were treating her like an officer instead of like a burden. But with that recognition came the full weight of responsibility. If her plan failed, if Rodriguez died, if any of her soldiers were hurt following her lead, the blame would be entirely hers. Morrison's voice cut through the tactical chatter like broken glass. All units, you are in direct violation of orders. I am calling for immediate disciplinary action against any soldier who participates in this unauthorized operation. Sarah heard the threat, understood its implications, but she also heard something else in Morrison's voice that surprised her. Fear. Not fear of combat. Morrison was too experienced for that, but fear of losing control, of watching his authority challenged by someone he'd dismissed as inexperienced. It was the kind of fear that made leaders make bad decisions, the kind of institutional thinking her West Point instructors had warned against. Jackson's voice broke the tension. Alpha 5 requesting clarification. Are we prioritizing the captain's orders or Alpha 3's survival? It was a simple question that cut to the heart of military leadership. Orders were absolute, the foundation of military discipline and effectiveness. But the primary mission of any unit was to bring everyone home alive. When those two imperatives conflicted, what was a soldier supposed to do? Sarah made her decision. I'm taking full responsibility for this operation. Any soldier who doesn't want to participate can maintain defensive position without consequence. But I'm not leaving Alpha 3 to die while we wait for air support that might arrive too late. She switched to Rodriguez's individual frequency. Alpha 3, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to create a distraction that will draw attention away from your position. When I give the signal, you'll have approximately 30 seconds to move to the extraction point I'm about to describe. Rodriguez's response came weak but determined. Copy, Alpha 7, ready to receive instructions. Sarah looked through her scope again, tracing the path Rodriguez would need to follow. It was a complex route that would require the sergeant to move through partially collapsed sections of the factory, around the IED's kill radius, and through terrain that would provide minimal cover. But it was possible, and more importantly, it was their only chance. As Sarah prepared to coordinate what would either be the most successful operation of her military career or the end of it, she thought about Emma's calculus teacher and the patterns that weren't obvious. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem wasn't following the established formula, it was seeing the connections that everyone else missed. Sarah keyed her radio one final time, addressing the entire squad with the kind of quiet authority she'd never known she possessed. All Alpha units were going to bring our soldier home. On my mark, synchronize suppressive fire, duration 30 seconds. Alpha 3, you move on the third burst. Everyone else, trust your training and trust each other. She paused, feeling the weight of her grandfather's compass against her chest, the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of military service distilled into this single moment of decision. Execute. The battle that followed would be analyzed in after-action reports, discussed in tactical training courses, and remembered by everyone who participated as the moment when Lieutenant Sarah Chen stopped being Morrison's rookie and became Alpha 7, a leader worth following into impossible situations. The coordinated suppressive fire that erupted across the factory complex sounded like the world tearing apart at its seams. Sarah had heard gunfire before, during training exercises and minor skirmishes, but this was different. This was her plan being executed by soldiers who had chosen to trust her judgment over their captain's explicit orders. From her elevated position, Sarah watched the tactical situation unfold with crystalline clarity. Thompson's first burst drew immediate return fire from the northwest corner, exactly as she'd predicted. Williams followed with precision shots that forced 3 insurgents to abandon their positions near the main entrance. Jackson, despite his youth and relative inexperience, laid down suppressive fire with the steady rhythm of a metronome, creating the audio cover Rodriguez would need for her movement. Alpha 3, execute now, Sarah commanded, tracking Rodriguez's movement through her scope while simultaneously identifying new target positions. The sergeant moved with surprising speed despite her wound, following the extraction route Sarah had described with the kind of tactical precision that came from years of combat experience. But as Rodriguez cleared the first obstacle, a pile of collapsed concrete that had been providing her cover, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. The IED she'd identified wasn't the only one. There was a second device, smaller and better concealed, positioned along the route she'd planned for Rodriguez's extraction. The sergeant was moving directly toward it, and Sarah had less than 10 seconds to warn her before she triggered a blast. That would kill them both. Alpha 3, stop immediately. Sarah's voice cracked with urgency. Secondary device, 2 meters ahead of your position. Rodriguez froze mid-stride, her body language communicating perfect trust despite the impossible situation. She was exposed in the open, under enemy fire, with hostile forces on 3 sides and explosive devices blocking both her current position and her planned extraction route. Any normal soldier would have panicked. Rodriguez simply keyed her radio and said, "Copy, Alpha 7. Requesting alternative instructions." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, calculating angles and distances while suppressive fire continued around them. The second IED changed everything, not just Rodriguez's extraction route, but the entire tactical understanding of the situation. The insurgents hadn't just been defending their cache. They'd been leading Sarah's unit into elaborately prepared kill zone. Every piece of cover they'd used, every position they'd taken, had been anticipated and weaponized. Morrison's voice cut through the tactical chatter, sharp with a mixture of authority and something that might have been grudging respect. "Alpha 7, this is Alpha 1. What's your current assessment?" It was the first time Morrison had called her by her unit designation instead of rookie, and Sarah felt the significance of that change even as she processed the tactical nightmare unfolding around them. "Alpha 1, we have multiple concealed explosive devices creating a complex kill zone. Enemy forces appear to be withdrawing while funneling us toward prepared positions." "Copy that, Alpha 7. Morrison paused, and Sarah could hear gunfire and movement in his background. "Air support is now 8 minutes out. Can you maintain overwatch until extraction?" Sarah looked at Rodriguez, still frozen in the open, still trusting that her lieutenant would find a solution to an impossible problem. 8 minutes was a lifetime in combat, especially for someone losing blood while exposed to enemy fire. But it was also long enough for Sarah to attempt something that would either save Rodriguez's life or end both of theirs. "Alpha 1, I'm going to attempt direct extraction of Alpha 3. Requesting squad-level suppressive fire for cover." Morrison's response came without hesitation. "Negative, Alpha 7. Too much risk for uncertain outcome." Sarah felt the familiar weight of conflicting imperatives, the order to maintain safe position versus the moral imperative to save a wounded soldier. But this time, something had changed in the dynamic between her and Morrison. He'd called her Alpha 7. He'd asked for her tactical assessment. He was treating her like an officer whose judgment mattered, even as he overruled her decision. Alpha 1, respectfully requesting permission to attempt extraction. I have a plan. There was a long pause before Morrison responded, and when he did, his voice carried the kind of weariness that came from years of making impossible decisions. Alpha 7, explain your plan. Sarah looked through her scope again, seeing the factory complex not as a maze of obstacles, but as a three-dimensional puzzle that could be solved with the right combination of timing, positioning, and calculated risk. The service catwalk she'd used to reach her current position extended further into the building than she'd initially realized. If she could traverse them without being detected, she might be able to reach a position directly above Rodriguez's location. I can use the maintenance level to approach Alpha 3's position from above. Rope extraction through the roof access, bypassing all ground-level explosive devices. Negative, Morrison responded immediately. Those catwalks weren't designed to support combat operations. Structural integrity is unknown. Sarah understood Morrison's concern, but she also understood that Rodriguez was growing weaker by the minute. Through her scope, she could see that the sergeant's movements were becoming less precise. Her responses to tactical communication slightly delayed. Blood loss was taking its toll, and conventional extraction methods weren't going to work with the complex IED placement surrounding her position. Alpha 1, I have rope and rappelling gear. I can secure Alpha 3 and extract her vertically, avoiding all known explosive devices. Williams joined the conversation, his experienced voice carrying tactical understanding that cut through command hesitation. Alpha 2 confirming structural assessment. Those catwalks are industrial grade, designed for equipment maintenance. They'll support the weight, Thompson added his analysis. Alpha 4 has been monitoring enemy communications. They're definitely in withdrawal phase, but they're leaving rear guard to cover the explosive devices. Time is critical. Sarah felt the tactical consensus building around her plan, but she also understood that Morrison was facing the same kind of impossible decision she'd been wrestling with all day. If he approved her operation and it failed, he would be responsible for losing 2 soldiers instead of 1. If he maintained defensive positions and Rodriguez died, he would be responsible for failing to attempt a rescue. Jackson's young voice cut through the tactical discussion with startling clarity. Alpha 5, requesting permission to speak freely. Morrison's response was terse. Go ahead, Alpha 5. Sir, Alpha 7's plan is sound. But more than that, she's been right about everything today. The IED placement, the enemy withdrawal pattern, the tactical positioning. Maybe it's time we trusted her judgment. Sarah felt something shift in the communication patterns of her squad. Jackson's words weren't just an endorsement of her plan. They were a recognition of her competence that had been building throughout the engagement. Thompson and Williams had been following her tactical assessments. Rodriguez had trusted her instructions even while wounded and exposed. Even Morrison had started using her proper unit designation instead of dismissing her as rookie. Morrison's next words carried the weight of a career soldier acknowledging a truth he'd been reluctant to accept. Alpha 7, you have permission to attempt extraction. All units will provide maximum suppressive fire during your operation. But if this goes wrong, I take full responsibility, Sarah finished, understanding the unspoken implications. Morrison was giving her the chance to prove herself, but he was also making clear that failure would end her military career. Sarah began moving along the catwalk system, testing each section before committing her weight, the metal. Structures groaned and shifted under her movement, but they held. Below her, she could see the insurgents continuing their withdrawal, but they'd left behind a sophisticated network of explosive devices that would deny her Unit access to the weapons cache, even after the immediate threat was neutralized. As she moved deeper into the building's maintenance level, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what they'd encountered. This wasn't just a weapons cache or a meeting point. It was a training facility designed to teach insurgent cells how to set up complex ambush using industrial buildings as tactical advantages. The IED placement, the withdrawal routes, the defensive positions, all of it had been carefully planned and repeatedly practiced. Sarah reached the position directly above Rodriguez and secured her rappelling line to a structural beam that looked capable of supporting both their weights. She checked her equipment one final time: rope secure, medical kit accessible, weapon ready. Then she keyed her radio for what might be the last time as Alpha 7. All units, I'm beginning extraction. Maintain suppressive fire until I signal all clear. The descent felt like falling through a war zone in slow motion. Sarah rappelled down through the factory's broken ceiling, past twisted metal and concrete debris, while gunfire erupted around her like deadly fireworks. She landed beside Rodriguez with the kind of precision that came from hundreds of practice repetitions, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of the sergeant's condition up close. Rodriguez was pale, her uniform soaked with blood, but her eyes were alert and focused. "About time you got here, Lieutenant," she said with the kind of dark humor that combat soldiers use to process impossible situations. Sarah immediately began field medical assessment while securing the extraction harness around Rodriguez's torso. The wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening if they could get her to medical facilities quickly. More importantly, Rodriguez was conscious and responsive, which meant the extraction was feasible. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, tightening the harness straps while monitoring the tactical situation around them. "Like I've been shot," Rodriguez replied. "But I've been shot before. What I haven't seen before is a lieutenant who rappels into a kill zone to extract wounded soldiers. That's either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid." Sarah began the extraction sequence, both of them rising slowly through the factory's damaged ceiling while suppressive fire provided cover below. "I'm hoping for brave, but I'll settle for effective." As they cleared the roofline, Sarah could see the full tactical picture for the first time. Air support was approaching from the south, 2 Apache helicopters that would arrive within minutes. The insurgents had completed their withdrawal, taking most of their equipment, but leaving behind enough explosive devices to deny the area to coalition forces. And her own squad was positioned in a defensive perimeter that suggested they'd been working together with unprecedented coordination. Sarah and Rodriguez touched down on the factory's roof, both of them breathing hard from adrenaline and exertion. Rodriguez immediately activated her emergency medical beacon, while Sarah established overwatch position to cover their extraction. From this elevated position, she could see movement patterns throughout the surrounding area that suggested the insurgents had planned multiple contingency routes for exactly this kind of situation. Morrison's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece, and for the first time since she'd known him, it carried what sounded like genuine respect. "Alpha 7, outstanding work. Medical evacuation helicopters inbound, ETA 3 minutes. Sarah felt something inside her chest that might have been relief, or might have been the first recognition that she'd actually succeeded. She'd violated direct orders, risked court-martial, and put herself in mortal danger. But Rodriguez was alive. The mission objectives had been at least partially achieved, and her squad had worked together with the kind of tactical coordination that would normally take months to develop. Rodriguez struggled to a sitting position, her back against a ventilation unit that provided cover from potential sniper fire. "You know what this means, don't you?" she asked, her voice carrying exhaustion and something that might have been pride. "What does it mean?" "It means Morrison can't call you rookie anymore, not after today." Sarah looked out over the factory complex, seeing it now as the site of her first real test as a combat leader rather than as a tactical obstacle. The sun was setting over Fallujah, painting the broken landscape in shades of gold and red that seemed almost beautiful despite the violence that had just occurred. In a few hours, she would face whatever consequences Morrison decided to impose for her violations of direct orders. But right now, with Rodriguez alive beside her and air support approaching, Sarah felt like she'd finally begun to understand what her grandfather had meant about the compass showing the right path instead of the easy one, the medical evacuation. Helicopter arrived with the kind of mechanical precision that made the chaos of combat seem temporarily manageable. As Rodriguez was loaded onto the aircraft, she grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's rotors. "Not just for the extraction, for treating me like someone worth saving." Sarah watched the helicopter disappear into the distance, carrying Rodriguez toward medical facilities that would ensure her recovery. Then she turned her attention to the tactical situation her squad still faced, a partially completed mission, potential disciplinary action, and the beginning of what she hoped would be a different kind of relationship with Morrison and her fellow soldiers. As she prepared to rejoin her unit, Sarah's radio crackled with Thompson's voice. "Alpha 7, this is Alpha 4. Outstanding leadership today. Looking forward to working with you on future operations," Williams followed. Alpha 2 concurring. "Solid tactical thinking under pressure." Jackson's enthusiastic voice came last. Alpha 5 requesting permission to serve under Alpha 7's command on future missions. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of military leadership. It wasn't about following orders or even about tactical competence. It was about earning the kind of trust that made soldiers willing to follow you into impossible situations, about proving that you valued their lives enough to risk your own career to save them. Morrison's voice cut through the congratulations, carrying his familiar authority, but with an undertone Sarah had never heard before. "Alpha 7, report to my position for debrief. We need to discuss what happened here today." Sarah knew that conversation would determine her future in the military. Morrison could file charges that would end her career, or he could recognize that she demonstrated the kind of leadership the Army needed in combat situations. But as she made her way down from the factory roof to rejoin her squad, Sarah realized that the outcome of that conversation mattered less than the recognition that she'd finally begun to understand who she was as an officer and as a leader. Mission wasn't over, but something fundamental had changed in Sarah's relationship with her unit, with Morrison, and with her own understanding of what it meant to be a combat leader. For the first time since arriving in Iraq, she felt like she belonged here, not as Morrison's rookie, but as Alpha 7, a lieutenant worth following. The debrief took place in Morrison's makeshift command post, a reinforced trailer that served as both tactical operations center and administrative office. Sarah stood at attention while Morrison reviewed the after-action report, his weathered face revealing nothing about his assessment of her performance. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters and the mechanical hum of communication equipment. Finally, Morrison looked up from his paperwork. "Sit down, Lieutenant." It was the first time he'd called her Lieutenant instead of Alpha 7 or Rookie, and Sarah felt the significance of that change as she took the chair across from his desk. Morrison leaned back, studying her with the kind of analytical attention she'd seen him apply to tactical problems. "Tell me what you think happened out there today," he said. Sarah had been preparing for this conversation since the extraction, but Morrison's question was broader than she'd expected. He wasn't asking for a tactical summary or a justification of her actions. He was asking for her interpretation of events. That had fundamentally changed the dynamic of their unit. "I think I learned the difference between following orders and exercising command responsibility," Sarah said carefully. "And I think the squad learned to work together under pressure in ways we hadn't achieved during previous operations." Morrison nodded slowly. "And what do you think I learned?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about Morrison's evolution. During the engagement, from dismissive authority figure to tactical collaborator, to someone who had ultimately supported her extraction plan despite its risks. I think you learned that competence doesn't always come with experience, and that good tactical thinking can emerge from sources you hadn't considered before. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that reminded Sarah of Rodriguez's unconscious map tracing. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone acknowledging a difficult truth. I've been in combat for 15 years, Lieutenant. I've seen young officers get soldiers killed because they thought their education was enough to substitute for experience. I've seen good people die because someone prioritized textbook tactics over battlefield reality. He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. I've also seen experienced soldiers fail to adapt when situations demanded new approaches. Today, you showed me something I'd forgotten about leadership. Sarah waited for him to continue, understanding that this conversation was as much about Morrison's own evolution as it was about her performance. Leadership isn't about experience or education or rank, Morrison continued. It's about making the right decision when all the options are bad, and then taking responsibility for the consequences. You did that today. You risked your career to save Rodriguez, and you did it with tactical competence that kept the rest of the squad safe. Morrison pulled out a different file, one that Sarah recognized as her personnel record. I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star for valor in combat operations. More importantly, I'm recommending you for tactical command position on future operations. The squad has requested to remain under your leadership. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. A recognition that the day's events had changed not just her relationship with Morrison, but her entire understanding of her place in the military hierarchy. Sir, I violated direct orders. Shouldn't there be disciplinary action? Morrison smiled for the first time since Sarah had known him. Lieutenant, you exercised command initiative in a combat situation, where following orders would have resulted in the death of a soldier under your command. That's not insubordination, that's leadership. The Army needs officers who can make those kinds of decisions. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched her relationship with the squad continue to evolve. Thompson began coming to her with tactical questions that went beyond her official responsibilities. Williams started treating her opinions as equivalent to Morrison's during mission planning sessions. Jackson asked her to mentor him through advanced tactical training, recognizing her as someone who could bridge the gap between textbook knowledge and practical application. But the most significant change was in Rodriguez's recovery process. The sergeant had been evacuated to a military hospital in Germany, where she underwent surgery to repair damage from her wound. Throughout her recovery, she maintained regular communication with Sarah, providing tactical insights and leadership. Advice that helped Sarah grow into her new role within the unit. You saved my life, Rodriguez told her during one of their video calls. But more than that, you showed the entire squad what good leadership looks like under pressure. That's not something you can teach in a classroom or learn from a manual. That's something you either have or you don't, and you definitely have it. Sarah's sister Emma noticed the change in their communications. You sound different in your letters, Emma wrote. More confident, like you figured out something important about yourself. Dad noticed it too. He says you're writing like an officer now instead of like someone trying to prove she deserves to be an officer. Their father, the retired Marine colonel, sent his own letter a few weeks later. Your mother and I are proud of the leader you've become. Command isn't about rank or authority. It's about earning the trust of the people who depend on your decisions. From what I hear through military channels, you've done exactly that. 6 months after the factory operation, Sarah received new orders, promotion to captain, and assignment to train newly commissioned officers in tactical leadership. Her first training class included 3 young lieutenants fresh out of West Point, all of them eager to prove themselves, and all of them making the same mistakes she'd made during her early deployment. Sarah's approach to training reflected everything she'd learned from Morrison Rodriguez and her own experience. She emphasized tactical thinking over rule following, collaborative decision-making over rigid hierarchy, and the kind of leadership that earned respect through competence rather than demanding it through rank. Military leadership is about understanding that your primary responsibility is to the people under your command, she told her first class of new officers. Everything else, mission objectives, career advancement, personal recognition, comes second to bringing your soldiers home alive. But you can't do that effectively by just following orders or applying textbook solutions. You have to think, adapt, and be willing to take responsibility for decisions that might be wrong. Rodriguez returned to active duty 8 months after her injury, fully recovered and promoted to staff sergeant. Her first request was reassignment to Sarah's training unit, where she could help develop the next generation of tactical leaders. "You taught me something important that day in the factory," Rodriguez told Sarah during their reunion. "You taught me that good leadership can come from unexpected sources, and that experience is valuable, but it's not the only qualification for command. Now I want to help teach that to other soldiers." Morrison, meanwhile, had been promoted to major and assigned to develop new tactical training protocols based on the lessons learned from operations like the factory engagement. His new training manuals emphasized adaptive thinking, collaborative leadership, and the kind of tactical flexibility that Sarah had demonstrated. "The military is changing," Morrison explained to Sarah during one of their periodic conversations. "We need officers who can think beyond conventional approaches, who can lead through competence rather than just authority. What you did in Iraq is becoming the model for how we train new leaders." Sarah's unit became something of a legend within military training circles, not because of the tactical success of the factory operation, but because of how it demonstrated the evolution of military leadership under pressure. The operation was studied in tactical training courses, analyzed in leadership seminars, and cited as an example of how good decisions could emerge from collaborative thinking rather than rigid command structures. But for Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Her grandfather, now in his 80s and showing signs of age, called her during one of her training rotations. "I heard about what you did in Iraq," he said in Mandarin, the language he still used for family conversations. "Your compass served you well." "The compass you gave me helped me find the right direction," Sarah replied in English, her Mandarin still not fluent enough for complex emotional conversations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "The compass didn't find the direction," her grandfather corrected gently. "You found the direction. The compass just reminded you to trust your own judgment when everything else was uncertain." Sarah understood then that her grandfather's gift had never been about navigation in the literal sense. It had been about learning to trust the internal compass that good leaders developed through experience, training, and the willingness to take responsibility for difficult decisions. 2 years after the factory operation, Sarah received a letter from Thompson, who had been promoted and assigned to a different unit. "I wanted you to know that I use the tactical approaches you taught us in every operation I lead," he wrote. "You showed us that good leadership isn't about rank or experience. It's about making the right decision when lives depend on it." That lesson has stayed with me. Similar letters came from Williams, Jackson, and eventually Morrison himself. Each of them described how the factory operation had changed their understanding of military leadership, collaborative decision-making, and the importance of earning respect through competence rather than demanding it through authority. But the letter that meant the most to Sarah came from her sister Emma, now a freshman at West Point and preparing for her own military career. "I've been studying the operation you led in Iraq," Emma wrote. "Not because it's required reading, but because I wanted to understand what happened that day that changed everything for you. I think I'm beginning to understand that leadership isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about being willing to find the answers when people are depending on you. I hope I can be that kind of leader when my time comes." Sarah realized that the factory operation had created ripple effects that extended far beyond her own career, or even her unit's tactical development. It had become part of a larger evolution in military thinking, a recognition that good leadership could emerge from collaborative thinking and adaptive decision-making rather than just rigid adherence to traditional command structures. The day Morrison stopped calling her rookie had been the beginning of Sarah's understanding of what it meant to be a leader. But the real transformation had come through the recognition that leadership was about earning the trust of people who were willing to follow you into impossible situations, about proving that you valued their lives enough to risk your own career to save them. 3 years later, Captain Sarah Chen stood before a new class of second lieutenants at Fort Benning, watching their eager faces as they prepared for their first tactical leadership exercise. Among them was a young woman who reminded her of herself 3 years earlier, technically proficient, academically excellent, and completely unprepared for the psychological realities of combat leadership. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sarah called, addressing the young woman who shared no relation to her former captain, but whose surname brought back memories of the factory operation every time Sarah heard it. "What's your assessment of the tactical situation?" Lieutenant Morrison studied the training scenario with the kind of textbook precision that Sarah recognized from her own early military experience. "Ma'am, I recommend establishing defensive positions and waiting for air support to neutralize the threat." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was exactly the kind of conventional thinking that would have gotten Rodriguez killed in Iraq. "That's a tactically sound approach, Lieutenant. But what if air support is delayed? What if you have wounded soldiers who need immediate extraction? What if following standard procedures means watching good people die?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see the young officers processing the implications. This was the moment when academic knowledge confronted the psychological reality of command responsibility, when following orders conflicted with saving lives. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward from her position as senior instructor. "Ma'am, permission to share a combat example?" "Granted, Staff Sergeant." Rodriguez addressed the class with the kind of authority that came from having been on both sides of impossible tactical decisions. 3 years ago, I was wounded and trapped in a kill zone in Fallujah. My lieutenant had direct orders to maintain defensive positions and wait for air support. If she had followed those orders, I would have bled out before help arrived. Sarah watched the young officers' reactions, seeing their understanding shift as Rodriguez described the tactical and psychological complexities of the factory operation. These weren't just theoretical problems from a training manual. These were real decisions that real leaders had to make when lives depended on their judgment. "What did your lieutenant do?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. Rodriguez smiled. "She violated direct orders, risked court-martial, and saved my life using tactical thinking that no one had taught her in school. She made the right decision when all the options were bad, and she took responsibility for the consequences." Sarah felt the familiar weight of her grandfather's compass in her pocket, now a talisman she carried during all her training sessions. The brass had grown even more worn over the years, polished smooth by her unconscious handling during difficult moments. But the inscription remained clear, Chinese characters that she'd finally learned to read. "The path forward is found in the heart that serves others." 5 years later, Major Sarah Chen returned to Iraq as part of a cultural exchange program designed to train Iraqi military officers in collaborative leadership techniques. The factory complex where she'd first proven herself as a combat leader had been demolished and replaced with a technical training center that served both military and civilian populations. Standing in the courtyard, where she'd once rappelled, Down to extract Rodriguez, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the years since that operation. The tactical approaches she'd pioneered during the factory engagement had been incorporated into standard military training. Collaborative decision-making had become a cornerstone of modern military leadership doctrine. The kind of adaptive thinking that Morrison had once dismissed as dangerous improvisation was now considered essential for effective combat command. Rodriguez, now a sergeant major, had accompanied Sarah on the training mission. Together, they taught Iraqi officers the same lessons they'd learned in this exact location, that good leadership emerged from earning trust rather than demanding obedience, that tactical flexibility was more valuable than rigid adherence to doctrine, and that the primary responsibility of any leader was bringing their people home alive. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't made that climb? Rodriguez asked during one of their evening conversations. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the cascade of consequences that had flowed from that single decision to trust her own judgment over Morrison's explicit orders. I think about it all the time. Not just what would have happened to you, but what would have happened to me. If I hadn't learned to trust my own tactical thinking that day, I never would have become the kind of leader I am now. Rodriguez nodded. And if you hadn't proven that competence could come from unexpected sources, Morrison never would have changed his approach to training new officers. We probably wouldn't be here teaching these techniques to the next generation. Sarah looked out over the training center that had replaced the factory complex, watching Iraqi and American officers working together on tactical problems that required collaborative thinking and adaptive leadership. The work they were doing here represented something larger than individual career development. It was part of a fundamental shift in how military organizations approach leadership development and tactical decision-making. 7 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen received a call from the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning that changed her understanding of how far the ripple effects of the factory operation had spread. She was being offered command of a new multinational training facility designed to develop adaptive leadership skills for military officers from allied nations. The position requires someone who understands both tactical competence and collaborative leadership, the personnel officer explained. Your work in Iraq and your training innovations at Fort Benning make you the ideal candidate for this role. Sarah accepted the position, understanding that it represented the culmination of everything she'd learned since Morrison had stopped calling her rookie. But more than that, it represented an opportunity to institutionalize the kind of leadership approach that had saved Rodriguez's life and transformed her own understanding of military command. The new facility was built in Virginia, with training programs designed around the principle that good leadership emerged from collaborative thinking rather than hierarchical authority. Officers from 12 different nations came to study tactical decision-making, adaptive leadership, and the kind of strategic thinking that Sarah had first demonstrated during the factory operation. Morrison, now a full colonel, served as Sarah's deputy commander. Their working relationship had evolved into something that neither of them could have imagined during their early days in Iraq, a collaboration between two leaders who had learned to respect each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. You know what's funny about that day in the factory? Morrison said during one of their planning sessions for the new facility. I thought I was testing whether you could follow orders under pressure. I didn't realize I was actually learning whether I could adapt my leadership style when circumstances demanded it. Sarah understood that Morrison's evolution had been as significant as her own. He'd learned to recognize competence regardless of its source, to value tactical thinking over rigid adherence to doctrine, and to see leadership development as a collaborative process rather than a hierarchical one. 10 years later, Colonel Sarah Chen stood before the United Nations Military Staff Committee, presenting the results of a decade-long study on adaptive leadership in military organizations. The research had been built around the tactical approaches pioneered during the factory operation, now recognized as a turning point in modern military leadership theory. Traditional military hierarchies are designed for predictable conflict scenarios, Sarah explained to the assembled military leaders from around the world. But modern combat situations require adaptive thinking, collaborative decision-making, and the kind of tactical flexibility that can only emerge when leaders are willing to trust competence regardless of its source. The presentation included case studies from dozens of military operations where adaptive leadership had led to successful outcomes that conventional approaches couldn't have achieved. The factory operation was cited not as an example of successful tactical execution, but as a demonstration of how collaborative thinking could emerge under pressure when leaders were willing to trust each other's judgment. Rodriguez, now a command sergeant major, served as Sarah's senior enlisted advisor. Their partnership had become a model for officer enlisted collaboration that was studied in military leadership courses around the world. Together, they had trained hundreds of officers in the kind of adaptive thinking that had once been considered dangerous improvisation but was now recognized as essential for effective military leadership. The lesson isn't that young officers should disobey orders, Rodriguez explained to the UN committee. The lesson is that good leadership requires the wisdom to know when circumstances demand adaptive thinking, and the courage to take responsibility for decisions that might be wrong. 15 years later, Brigadier General Sarah Chen received a letter from her sister Emma, now a major serving in Afghanistan and applying the leadership techniques she'd learned from studying Sarah's career. Emma's letter described a tactical situation where she'd been forced to choose between following established procedures and saving the lives of soldiers under her command. "I thought about the factory operation," Emma wrote. "Not the tactical details, but the psychological moment when you decided to trust your own judgment over external authority. I made the same kind of decision yesterday, and it worked. 3 soldiers are alive because I'd learned from your example that sometimes leadership means being willing to be wrong in service of being right." Sarah realized that the factory operation had become more than just a personal career milestone or even a tactical case study. It had become part of a family legacy, a demonstration of the kind of leadership that valued human life over institutional procedure, that trusted competence over rank, that recognized that good decisions could emerge from collaborative thinking rather than hierarchical authority. Her grandfather had passed away 2 years earlier, but not before seeing Sarah promoted to general rank. During his final conversation with her, he'd spoken in Mandarin about the compass he'd given her so many years before. "The inscription doesn't just mean the path forward is found in the heart that serves others," he'd explained. "It means that true direction comes from understanding your responsibility to the people who trust your leadership. You learned that lesson well." 20 years later, Major General Sarah Chen stood in the cemetery at Arlington National Cemetery, attending Morrison's funeral with full military honors. He died peacefully at age 73, surrounded by family and remembered as one of the most innovative military leaders of his generation. His transformation from a rigid authoritarian to a collaborative leader had been studied in leadership courses for over a decade. Rodriguez, now retired but still active in military leadership development, delivered the eulogy. "Colonel Morrison taught us that good leaders never stop learning, never stop adapting, and never stop recognizing that competence can emerge from unexpected sources. He showed us that true strength comes from the willingness to change when circumstances demand it." After the service, Sarah and Rodriguez walked through the cemetery, reflecting on the careers that had been shaped by a single afternoon in a rocky factory complex 2 decades earlier. "Do you think we changed anything?" Rodriguez asked, gesturing toward the headstones of soldiers who had served under leaders trained in the adaptive leadership techniques they'd pioneered. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the hundreds of officers who had been trained in collaborative decision-making, the thousands of soldiers who had served under leaders who valued competence over rank, the countless tactical situations where adaptive thinking had led to successful outcomes that conventional approaches couldn't have achieved. I think we proved that good leadership isn't about rank or experience or education, Sarah said. It's about earning the trust of people who are willing to follow you into impossible situations, and then proving that their trust was well placed by making decisions that prioritize their lives over your career. Rodriguez nodded. And I think we proved that competence can emerge from anywhere, that good ideas don't always come from the top of the hierarchy, and that the best leaders are the ones who recognize and develop potential regardless of its source. 25 years later, General Sarah Chen delivered her final address as commander of the Joint Military Leadership Development Center, speaking to an audience that included military leaders from 37 nations, all of whom had been trained in the adaptive leadership techniques that had grown out of the factory operation. Leadership is not about commanding obedience, she told the assembled officers. It's about inspiring trust. It's not about following procedures. It's about making the right decision when all the options are difficult. It's not about proving your own competence. It's about recognizing and developing competence in others. Sarah's speech was carried. Live around the world. Broadcast to military facilities where young officers were learning the same lessons she'd discovered during her first real test as a combat leader. The factory operation had become legendary not for its tactical execution, but for its demonstration of what happened when leaders were willing to trust their own judgment and take responsibility for the consequences. After the ceremony, Sarah returned to her office to pack her personal belongings. Among them was her grandfather's compass, now worn so smooth that the inscription was barely visible. But Sarah didn't need to see the Chinese characters to remember their meaning. The path forward is found in the heart that serves others. She thought about Rodriguez, now in her 70s but still sharp, still mentoring young soldiers, still sharing the story of how a lieutenant's willingness to risk everything had saved her life and changed both their careers. She thought about Morrison, whose transformation from rigid authority figure to collaborative leader had influenced an entire generation of military officers. She thought about Thompson, Williams, Jackson, and all the other soldiers whose careers had been shaped by that single afternoon when everything changed. Most of all, she thought about Emma, now a general herself and continuing the family tradition of military service with the same commitment to collaborative leadership that had defined Sarah's career. Emma's own children were considering military service, carrying forward the lessons that had begun with their grandfather's compass and had been refined through decades of practical application. As Sarah prepared to leave her office for the final time, she received a message from the current class of officer candidates at West Point. They had named their Military Leadership Honor Society after her, recognizing her as the officer who had proven that good leadership could emerge from collaborative thinking, adaptive decision-making, and the willingness to trust competence, regardless of its source. The message included a photograph of the society's insignia, a brass compass surrounded by the words, "Trust your judgment. Serve your people." Below the image was a note from them. "Cadets, thank you for showing us that leadership isn't about rank or authority. It's about making the right decision when lives depend on your judgment." Sarah felt the familiar weight of her grandfather's compass as she read those words, understanding that the lessons learned in an Iraqi factory complex 25 years earlier had become part of the institutional memory of the American military. The day Morrison stopped calling her rookie had been the beginning of a career that had fundamentally changed how the military approached leadership development, tactical training, and collaborative decision-making. But more than that, it had been the beginning of a legacy that would continue long after her own retirement, carried forward by officers who understood that true leadership emerged not from the rigid application of authority, but from the willingness to serve others with competence, courage, and compassion. Sarah picked up her grandfather's compass one final time, feeling its worn surface and remembering the moment when she'd first learned to trust her own judgment over external authority. Then she placed it carefully in her briefcase, ready to pass it on to the next generation of leaders who would carry forward the lessons of adaptive thinking, collaborative leadership, and the courage to make difficult decisions when lives depended on their judgment. The factory operation was over, but its lessons would continue forever.